Hey guys, and welcome to the Fish Room. I'm Rachel O'Leary and it's time for a Tuesday tip. Now, today I thought I would take a second to talk to you about quarantine. I've gotten quite a few messages and comments saying that this is something you would like me to address, or most specifically, how I quarantine. So let's start with what is quarantine. Quarantine is basically just the forced isolation of, in this case, a fish, in order to prevent the transmission of illness or disease. Why do we do it? Because for a few reasons. First off is that if you have a display tank, theoretically you have fish in there that you want to keep. So you want to protect those species and your plants from having to medicate. Even healthy fish can carry pathogens. You have a display tank with all your fish that have been doing well, maybe for months, maybe for years. Their immune systems are strong, but it's entirely possible that those healthy fish have some sort of illness or pathogen that is being kept at bay because, you're doing your regular water changes, you're feeding them well, and their immune system is nice and high. So you want to protect incoming fish from what's in your established tank as much as you want to protect your established tank from new fish. New fish, may be seemingly healthy, but the stress of shipping, the change in water parameters, changes in diet, any of those things can stress a fish to a point where they can have disease crop up. For my application, I'm getting in a lot of wild fish. I know that perhaps it's extremely likely that they would have some sort of pathogen or intestinal parasite, and I need to make sure that they're eating, I need to make sure that they're pooping it normally, and I need to make sure that they don't have any obvious external symptoms. Each time a fish is transported, it stresses them more. So from the wild to the exporter, from the exporter to the wholesaler or transshipper, from the transshipper or wholesaler to the retailer, and then from the retailer to you. Each of those steps can add more stress to an otherwise healthy immune system and make a fish more prone to disease. That is one of the reasons why here, at least, I make sure I hold fish for at least 2 weeks of health before I start listing them for sale or shipping them. And sometimes it takes a lot longer, and some species I hold for a lot longer. So when I'm setting up a quarantine tank, I have like a multi-stage system that I use. Today we'll talk about setup and the first week. So I have a couple of different ways that I set up a tank. I use either your typical glass box, your aquarium, or I'll often use these little plastic sweater boxes or totes, whatever you want to call them. And these I think are especially good for the average hobbyist because you're not tempted to keep those going long term. One of the problems I had when I was simply a hobbyist and not a business is that every time I set up a quarantine tank, it became a display tank, and then the tanks spread across the house, through the kitchen, down the stairs, and into the basement we have today. By using these plastic totes, which are really affordable and food safe, you're not tempted to keep them going. So I really like them. Now they do have a few drawbacks. One is that obviously the clarity's not there, and the other thing is they're not as easy to net out of. But I use them quite frequently. I also use two main types of filters in my quarantine tanks. One are these Porette box filters, and the other are these old school $2 Lee's corner filters. And I like them for different reasons, and often in quarantine I'll use one of each. I like using the sponge filter because I keep spares in some of my big display tanks canister filters so that I can add cycled media right off the bat. By having a cycled tank, you're reducing even more stress to the fish. I like using these little corner filters as well because one of the drawbacks to using a sponge filter is that if you end up having to medicate, you have nowhere to put chemical media in order to remove the medication. So those little box filters are great for that because you can customize the media however you want. Now, canisters or hang-on backs, all of those are appropriate as well. This is just my personal preference for dealing with the small fishes and invertebrates that I deal with. When I'm quarantining hillstream species, I'll also add a power head as in this tank. I tend to keep my quarantine tanks bare bottom, no substrate, no rock, no wood for at least the first couple weeks. The porosity of rocks or substrate or even wood can harbor more pathogens. Also, while in quarantine, I tend to do daily large volume water changes, and when I drop the water, I rub the inside of the tank and the bottom of the glass during my water change, just to keep the tank as clean as possible. You may need to use the heater. I don't. I heat the fish room down here, and it's plenty comfortable for the vast majority of species. I have a few exceptions to that. I do use heaters for discus, rams, high pancistrus, and cardinal tetras. So for the first week in my fish room when I'm quarantining, I leave things completely bare. If in that week I don't have any obvious signs of illness, I don't have any deaths, I don't have any fish getting thinner or not eating, then after the first week I may add a plant. Simply because this makes the fish a bit more comfortable. It can help with the nitrification process, and it helps improve their color, which helps me get better photographs and videos. After they've gone through 2 weeks of quarantine, then I may add some minor decor, rocks, and depending on species, a handful of substrate, usually sand or fine gravel, specifically for things like loaches or cories or species that really depend on substrate for the best feeding strategy. I quarantine for my fish tanks, my displays, for 3 months. Now, that's a bit overkill, but a lot of the species that I'm currently really interested in are very difficult to treat with meds, expensive, and hard to source. For instance, the fish that are going into the 150. Those are fish that I may not be able to get again, so I want to make sure that I give them adequate time to show any sign of disease in a tank. Now, shrimp I do a little bit differently. If I'm bringing in shrimp from a Taiwan farm, for instance, those I quarantine heavily because they're prone to a few diseases, and I'm sure we'll talk about that stuff in the future. Different diseases have different life cycles and different expressions of that, and temperature can play a role. So if I was a hobbyist, I would do a minimum of a month quarantine. Most people quarantine for 1 to 2 weeks, but I really recommend 4 to 6, and that's because some diseases can take longer to show up than others. So the next time we talk about quarantine, I'll talk to you about some preventative medication, why medicate, why not medicate, as well as the specific strategies that I use with fish based on their source. Thanks for watching. Make sure you stop by my Facebook as well as my website, MsJinx.com, for my upcoming speaking engagements, my current stock list, and information on all things nano. As always, let me know in the comments if there's particular species or topics that you'd like for me to discuss.